I've been working for Georgia Cares for the past 5 years. Georgia Cares is the statewide coordinating agency for victims of domestic minor sex trafficking, which is under the umbrella of human trafficking. So we specifically serve victims who are under the age of 18 and residents of Georgia and who have been trafficked specifically for sex. They do not have to have been trafficked in Georgia, although that's the majority of our clients have been. So I've served in several roles at Georgia Cares. I started out as a care coordinator, which is basically a case manager position, so worked directly with our victims, providing coordinating services. And then I sort of worked my way up, and most recently I've served as the clinical director there, supervising the remaining social work staff. When I started 5 years ago, there were 2 social workers on staff, and now we have a dozen, which is a great opportunity for growth for our agency, and has been really cool to be a part of. And I actually, as of this week, transitioned into a new role of education coordinator, which is really exciting. So I'm going to get to do a lot more of these types of events, which is something that I've wanted to do for a long time. So happy to be here and to answer whatever questions anybody has.
I'd like to take this time to open it up to the floor if anyone has a question.
Not that I will see you.
I have some questions.
Oh, great.
Maybe I can.
Is it okay if I stand?
Oh my gosh, please.
Yes.
So you mentioned the education part, and that I think is really important, right? Because the reason why we do things like this, like plays like that, is to get it out to the public, to the general public. Because I know that this topic, in my experience, is something that we know about, kind of semi-halfway acknowledge, but don't really, further actions. I do want to talk maybe a little bit more on what the educational component would be to the general public.
Sure.
And then we have Maria to join us as well.
Yes.
Hi, Maria.
Amazing. Hi, everybody.
Wasn't she amazing? I definitely want to, don't let me forget, because I want to speak to something that your character specifically brought out in a minute. But as far as education, that is one of the 4 strategic priorities of our agency, Georgia Cares. We offer emergency response and assistance. We do provide a 24-hour hotline that is staffed by community volunteers. So if you're interested in ways that you can participate and get involved as a volunteer, that is one of the things that we do offer. We also do victim support, which is more of the direct services to clients. Our 3rd strategic priority is coordination and collaboration. So that's just a fancy way of saying that we work with community partners, like all those folks that were listed in your playbill, for lack of a better word. And the 4th is education. So we do trainings all over the state, and we do them free of charge. We will go to a women's group at a church or a community center. We will go to large events where they're a statewide conference for 500 people. Really doesn't matter what the event is or who the audience is, because we want to train and educate people. The thing that was so, I guess, surprising to me as I got into this work, because I started out my career in child welfare and worked with child survivors of abuse and neglect. And so I felt like I had a pretty good handle on that sector of our population until I started working with this population of trafficking victims. And it just sort of struck me one day that after all these decades and decades of providing child welfare services to victims of abuse and neglect, we are just now scratching the surface for providing services and support to victims of sex trafficking. And I really honestly still can't quite get my head around that it has taken so long for us to acknowledge this problem and to connect it with an extreme form of child abuse. So part of what we struggle with as agencies that serve this population is that we're just really way behind. And so we're kind of scrambling to catch up in terms of creating things like Project Dawn, or even having a statewide coordinating agency like Georgia Cares, which, by the way, Georgia's the only state in the country that has a statewide coordinating agency for child sex trafficking victims. Independent cities have similar programs. Georgia's the only state that has a statewide program. And so we still have a long way to go, which is why the education piece is so important. And Morgan said most people, she thinks most people kind of do know. Y'all, a lot of people don't know. And worse, a lot of people don't want to hear and don't want to know. So I'm so grateful to all the folks involved with Project Dawn for not only bringing awareness, but to folks like you who are willing to become aware and to hear the message and to know the experience, not only of the victims, but of the people who work with the victims. That was what was so telling to me. I was asked to kind of talk about my response, I guess, to the play. I was so stunned to see such an accurate representation of the struggles that we go through as caregivers. The secondary trauma, the compassion fatigue, the burnout, it's very real. It's very real. And nobody talks about that. Because you're sort of expected, like, you chose this work, you chose this life of no money and nonprofit and late hours. And it's, yes, true, signed on for that, I'll fully admit. But I'm so grateful to have that piece recognized and honored too. That was super impactful for me tonight. I thought I saw a hand. Was it you? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, talk about lack of education. Can you define trafficking as opposed to other sex industry?
Sure. So I'm going to try to keep it simple because there's different definition for federal legislation and Georgia statute. But let me just be clear that if you hear the term domestic minor sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children, we're talking about the same thing. DMST is more of the national federal language. CSEC is more state statute. The thing to always keep in mind is that there has to be a commercial element. So, a sexual assault of a child, meaning under the age of 18, whether it's one time or multiple times, isn't in and of itself sex trafficking if something of value is not given or promised. So something of value could be a ride, a meal, an article of clothing, a cell phone. Something has to be given or promised to the child in exchange for the sexual act in order for it to have that commercial element, and that's what constitutes trafficking. You do not have to take the child physically from point A to point B, which I think is what's confusing about the language, is that you sort of assume, okay, they have to come across international borders or even state borders. No, they don't even have to leave their home in order to be trafficked if there's something of commercial or something of value is promised or given in exchange. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, great, great.
Another question over there?
Oh, sorry.
I will ask.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
So is any sort of education happening for actually children?
Oh, great question. Anytime we have an opportunity at my agency to do that, we jump on that. So anytime there's I participated a couple of years ago in a little roundtable discussion with a group of 8th grade girls who had chosen this topic as like a special project for their class, and we just sort of had a dialogue, and they put together a poster and things for their classmates. I wish I could do that every week, with classroom after classroom, school after school. We don't have a formal process in place for educating kids, but we absolutely say yes anytime we're asked to do something like that, and I think that's so critical. I live in Atlanta. I love being in a big city. I grew up in a really small rural town, and so there were a lot of things that I was protected from and not exposed to in my life and in my childhood. I go to bed grateful for those things every night because the things that my clients experience, I did not have to experience. And I think that it's a real shame that more people don't know at an early age, especially girls. There are male victims, there are gender non-binary or transgender victims. I think it's a real shame that more girls don't understand from a very young age the difference between love and sex and abuse. And that continuum and that sort of blurring of those lines for a lot of young girls is what leads to the stories that we heard about tonight. And I think that was the other big revelation for me in doing this work, is that I had never really thought about the fact that women at age 23 or 28 or 32 didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what I think would be like a really great life and like a really awesome way to make money. No, it's because they were exposed to this or coerced or forced into this or had no other way to survive than this when they were maybe 18, maybe 15, or maybe 11, right? And so then you know nothing else. You know nothing else. And that's why I feel like that education, to your point, is so critical at a very, very early age. And we're scared to talk about it, you know? This is not like sexy conversation for anybody. My husband, thank you for being here, he's supporting me. My husband Eric says, you know, you can really be like a major buzzkill at a dinner party. You know, somebody just casually says, hey, what do you do? And I'm like, oh. And they're like, anywho, right? Like nobody wants to talk about this. I mean, my dental hygienist almost like had an anxiety attack in the dental office a couple of years ago, and I'm like, it's okay, Cindy, really, it's fine. It's okay. But I mean, she was almost hyperventilating because she just couldn't quite grasp the reality of what happens. Not talking about Thailand, I was talking about Georgia, you know, and that's just a real shock for people. But hey, guess what, folks? I mean, we got to talk about it because it's happening to our kids, you know, and so we don't really have the luxury of just ignoring that this is a thing or pretending like we don't know about it. Yeah.
So as someone with a 9-year-old daughter, are there resources out there to talk to her? Or would you even suggest speaking to her about it now? Or if it comes up in conversation, or how does that?
Sure. So one of my favorite resources, and I think a couple of nights from now, Dr. Jordan Greenbaum is going to be here for this part of the evening. She's someone I admire so much. She's fabulous. She and her team at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta developed, for one, safety, internet safety tips that they publish on their website, because a lot of the ways that our child victims are being sort of lured into this life now is online. Because there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of sites where you can buy children for sex, and if the FBI or the whomever shut them all down tomorrow, then 2 days later there would be thousands and thousands more sites. So the internet safety tips are a great, like, kind of easy entry-level way to get into those conversations. They also have a series of webinars that are free and available. It's through the Stephanie V. Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children, which is basically their child advocacy center. They have a series of webinars that are, I feel like, pretty accessible for the layperson to learn about trafficking. I'd probably not go into the one about the medical stuff because it's a little bit overwhelming if you are not working in that environment, talking about sort of forensic exams and things like that. But the other ones they're more sort of entry level, and I think those are, you know, that's something you could sort of peruse as a parent and maybe pull out some pieces to show or to talk to your kid about. So that's one resource that I really love, and I don't work for them, but I used to work for them, and I still love them, so I don't mind giving Children's a plug.
Thank you.
So how are your clients referred to you, like through the courts? Or
Sure, great question. Anybody can refer a client to Georgia Cares. Primarily, our referrals come from DFACS, Division of Family and Children's Services, which is our state child welfare organization. the juvenile courts, either independent courts or Department of Juvenile Justice. Those are our two primary referral sources. Beyond that, next in line would probably be children's health care, and then school counselors or teachers, other healthcare or therapeutic providers in the community, child advocacy centers, and then on occasion just sort of concerned relative or citizen or community member, and on rare occasion a self-referral from a client. But we'll take a referral from anyone. We do require a release of information signed by the legal guardian so that we have permission to proceed with services. And then our first step is to do an assessment. It's kind of like a trauma assessment combined with a biopsychosocial assessment, if that means anything to anyone. And then from there we move forward with confirmed victims with our case management services. None of the services cost any money to anyone. Don't have to have insurance, don't have to pay a fee. It's not sliding scale, it's completely covered through our grant funding.
And that's what the Women in Project Dawn part also have. They get a survey at the beginning of which they get then to sign what their treatment plan is going to be,
Right.
that they have to sign up.
And that's so critical, I think, and I appreciate you mentioning that. It's so critical because I think what you heard a little bit about in the play, you heard about the intersectionality of victimization and mental illness, poverty, race, sort of all of those, anything where we can claim a privilege, some of us more than others. You heard about that, and sometimes those things cause the victimization as a result of trafficking to kind of take a back seat. And what I mean by that is we've had even adolescent clients who had a severe substance use issue or had severe mental health issues and were not medically or clinically stable when they were first referred to us. And so sometimes we have to make treatment decisions and do treatment planning around just getting them to a point where we can begin to work on trauma recovery, if that makes sense. And I'm sure that Project Dawn has had many of those challenges with their adult clients as well. And we saw some kind of pieces of that represented. So it's definitely something that I think the assessment is such a critical part for any victim, because we have to know what degree of victimization we're talking about, what the trauma history looks like, and we have to know all the other things that are at play with the victim in that moment in time. And then we reassess to hopefully we try to do that first assessment as a baseline, and then we reassess every 6 months to look at progress and to see where we need to sort of tweak a treatment plan.
Do you have volunteer opportunities for people that necessarily aren't very schooled in this situation but want to help?
Glad you asked. Let's see if I have some cash on me that I can bring up to you. We have several volunteer opportunities, and I brought something with me so I wouldn't forget to talk about this. Our formal volunteer tracks are being trained to become a hotline operator, which is staffing that hotline that's answered 24/7, taking in referrals, coordinating with law enforcement, medical providers, therapeutic providers, etc. And that's a really great way to get involved. And as a staff member who used to have to cover that hotline all the time, I'm so grateful to the community volunteers who do that now. You can also train with my new role as education coordinator. You can train with me to become a Speakers Bureau volunteer, which means that you could go to events like this and speak on the issue, but you are trained and sort of educated in it ahead of time. For people who that's too much or too scary or too intimidating, you can just come and be an administrative volunteer and file papers. It's a nonprofit, so we got plenty of documentation and stuff to file, I promise. But what I wanted to bring to your attention, and there's a billion of these out on the table by the ticket desk. If you just want to do one little thing right about this time of year, we have a holiday giving program where you can buy gift cards for our kids. So these are kids who have already been victimized, These are kids who are either in the community, they're in foster placements, they're in residential programs, they're in psychiatric hospitals, they're wherever. They're in jail. And you can buy either for basic needs or for educational and life skills and just support the holiday giving program. I think this is like a great way for people to kind of maybe dip their toes into sort of helping this population, because something like being on the hotline feels a little intimidating to folks, or being on the Speakers Bureau. But if you wanted to do some small thing, you can also just follow us on social media. Our website is gacares.org, and we have social media out the wazoo, you know, every platform you can name, always announcing events, fundraisers, opportunities. We have like one-day fundraisers. For example, we have a 5K run every summer. You can volunteer just for the 5K, and just that's your one day to volunteer to help support these victims. And we're so grateful for that. We're grateful for any of it. I don't know what we would do without the dozens and dozens of volunteers that we have.
It helps to facilitate your work.
It does.
Yeah,
And it takes the burden.
Yeah.
It takes the burden off, because it is hard to do it day in and day out sometimes. And to have people, like y'all, who legitimately want to sign up to do this and to help and give your own time, it means the world to us. It really does.
Because they're limited in funds, and a lot of the simple things that they could use, that they might pay someone else to do, they can't afford to pay them. So it's always helpful. All of the organizations in the playbill, they're always looking for volunteers to do even the
Yes.
simplest of things, and it just lightens the weight a little bit.
Yes. And I'll say, I'm looking through that list, and I'm looking through the list of speakers for this week, and I'm like, wow, how fortunate am I to have such an amazing group of people that I call friends and colleagues that are on this list. Folks that, maybe we're coming at it from slightly different angles, and yes, maybe we're kind of all fighting for the same money with grants and things like that, but ultimately, all with the same end goal in mind, which is to see these kids restored and thriving. And so I don't want to forget about your final scene.
Okay.
Those wins, WINS wins, those successes, those moments when a client finds their voice and realizes their value as a person, that honestly makes up for hundreds of little losses, little not so great successes, hard days in the office kind of thing. And so I love that was how the play ended, and that piece of this Lola story was portrayed, because that is the answer, not that you asked it, but that is the answer to the question, how do you keep doing the work? Like, how do you do this day in and day out? It's because of that. It's because one client found their voice and realized that they had value after months or years of us service providers trying to convince them of that. But it's not until the moment when the client realizes it themselves, that the real change has occurred. And so I just thank you for portraying that, because that was really beautiful, and that's something that's very special for me as a clinician.
Any other questions? I have a quick question for
Okay.
you. I think sometimes, would you tell us, in your experience, what demographic, what particular socioeconomic demographic do you see your clients coming from?
Sure.
Is there one specific group of community that they come from, or do you see them coming from the entire spectrum of every socioeconomic?
Sure. That's a great question. So I'll address it a couple of different ways. One is that demographically, our clients at Georgia Cares are fairly representative of the demographics of the counties we're receiving referrals from. If a county is primarily African American in its population, then the majority of our referrals from that county are going to be African American clients, if that makes sense. So it's a pretty good match. one thing that I think surprises people, and our average age of our clients at our agency is like they're maybe 13 and a half at time of referral. So average age while being served is maybe 15. I think we've had like little bitty young kids referred. But one thing that surprises people is, so does anybody know how many counties there are in Georgia by chance? There's a lot of them, 159. It's ridiculous. We have this like tiny little state and a million counties, 159. We've received referrals from 114. There are not 114 metro Atlanta counties. It sometimes seems like that, but there are not 114 counties that are considered large metropolitan areas. So we've got referrals from all over the state of Georgia, as rural gets, towns and places that you have never heard of and can barely find on the map. And if you can't find it on your GPS, you lose service an hour and a half before you get there. You know what I mean? Like that rural. And so that's the piece. And that was when I started 5 years ago. I think that number was like 50. And now it's 114. That doesn't mean it's because more and more kids are being trafficked, although maybe. But it means that the education is working. And that people now know to look for it and recognize it and look for warning signs. And so the only other thing about demographics that I would say is that although more of our clients come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that's absolutely true, it doesn't mean that kids from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are immune. Kids with lots of resources, lots of support, attending private school, going to very active on their dance team or their cheer team, stable two-parent household, lots of friends, very popular, et cetera, that doesn't make kids immune. It does not make kids immune. And I think that's the other piece that there's sort of a myth that you have to be poor or a person of color or from a single parent home or something like that to be vulnerable, and that's just not true. Basically, if you're a child and you're longing to be accepted and you're trying to fit in and you're trying to kind of find your way in the world, that makes you vulnerable. So that's pretty much starts with everybody, right? Because developmentally, every child is in that place, in early adolescence especially. And so now, yes, on that board down at the bottom of the stairs is a beautiful example of how you become more and more and more vulnerable. Because, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Or you don't have stability in your home, or all of the other things that are portrayed. Yes, that makes you more vulnerable, but I don't want to give the impression that you have to have like a checklist of like a minimum of 6 risk factors in order to be victimized, because that's just not what we see. That's not the case. Yeah.
Is there any attempt, I know they brought up the men at some point, when the victims come through, is there any attempt to find out who was the person causing the trouble, or you just focus mainly on getting the victim better?
Now, that's a great question. Our agency doesn't focus on investigating the perpetrators, but there are, we do collaborate with our law enforcement partners, our district attorneys, our forensic specialists, so that if they have information that our victim has disclosed, that they can pursue in bringing someone to justice, either a trafficker or a buyer, then we are part of that process in helping support our kids through a trial or a testimony. I've been able to sit through, a couple of trials where my kid's testimony resulted in, a guy getting 45 years plus. Those are pretty good moments too. And can I just quickly say one more thing about language? Because that's part of our education, to kind of tie it back to that. So the language used in the play tonight was spot on and very common among victims, especially whether they're childs or adults. So when I say language, I mean like pimp and John. Part of what we try to do in our education is when you're talking about minor victims, is to never use the word prostitute. Because child prostitute, specifically, has a completely different connotation than victim of child sex trafficking. Child prostitute makes it sound like a choice, and it makes it sound like it's a victimless crime. So that's part of the education that we do is, let's name it what it is. Like, you're buying sex with a child. You're not a John, you're a child sex buyer, right? You're not a pimp, which culturally kind of has a whole different whatever because of what was referenced, like movies, music, things like that. So we say trafficker or perpetrator. But with our kids, we use whatever language they're using. Because it's not my place, like when a kid is disclosing her horrific trauma history, for me to like put on my little educational, get on my educational high horse and say, well, now honey, really you should be talking about your pimp, you should be talking about your, trafficker. Okay, well in that moment it doesn't matter. But I just wanted to make that distinction because I thought it was extremely accurate in the way it was portrayed in the play. But if you hear people like me using, like, sort of avoiding pimp at all costs, there's a reason behind that. There's a reason behind that. And it's specifically because I work with child victims.
I think it is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there is a challenge, however, to prosecuting the people who do traffic other people.
Yeah, it's a very underground industry, for one thing. This is, it's not,